Welcome everyone to our next session of our annual Fall Implementation Science Seminar series. My name is Dr. Ariana Albanese. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Brown, and I'll be hosting the series today in place of Dr. DeRogers, who is our typical host. Our implementation science core in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Brown University has rebranded as the Brown Research on Implementation and Dissemination to Guide Evidence Use, or BRIDGE program. This is the 7th year of our implementation science programming, and we're thrilled to be able to bring these seminars to our Providence and Rhode Island community of implementation scientists, as well as those of you who are joining us from other states and regions of the world. We're grateful for the partnership of the Advanced Rhode Island Clinical and Translational Research, or Advance-CTR, for supporting the technology, logistics, and marketing of these seminars. We also recognize our partnership with the Brown Alcohol Research Center on HIV for their support. And today I'm excited to introduce Dr. Elizabeth McGuier. She is an assistant professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research aims to improve mental health outcomes for children who experience maltreatment through better implementation of evidence-based practices and expansion of mental health services into non-traditional settings. Dr. McGuier is a licensed clinical psychologist with specialized training in both child maltreatment and integrated primary care for rural and underserved populations. Her areas of expertise include implementation science, teamwork, child maltreatment, and children's mental health services. She is currently supported by a Career Development Award from the National Institute of Mental Health to examine how teamwork affects implementation in multidisciplinary team-based service settings. And the title of her talk today is Studying Teams in Implementation Science, Recommendations from a Systematic Review of Teamwork and Implementation Outcomes. As a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A, or in the chat, rather. You can put your questions right in the chat throughout the seminar, and you can just send it to everyone. And we will answer them from there. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. McGuier to begin her wonderful talk.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm excited to talk with you all today about some findings from our recently finished systematic review, as well as some recommendations for research in this area. So just an agenda, I'm going to start with some background on the science of teams. So to give you some context for our review, then we'll discuss the systematic review findings, and we'll close with some recommendations for doing implementation research with teams. I want to acknowledge the co-authors on the systematic review that I'm discussing today, as well as some of our research assistants who help with screening articles. As I'm sure many of you know, systematic reviews are quite a lot of work, so it took a big team. I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. The research that I'm discussing was funded by the National Institutes of Health under a few different grants, as well as the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and a research lab at Carnegie Mellon University. So to start us off with the science of teams, thinking first about implementation science, as you all know, implementation science is about bridging this gap between research and practice. What we want is a well-constructed bridge with knowledge that flows at high speed in both directions, something like the New River Gorge Bridge. But what we have is much more like the Kinzig Bridge. So still a lot of work to be done in this field. Implementation science has lots and lots of theories, models, and frameworks. And one thing they all have in common is that the context matters. They all acknowledge that there are multiple levels of influence and action during this dynamic process of implementation. So we know that implementation is influenced by barriers and facilitators at multiple levels. And in many settings, we have clients or patients who are nested within providers who work within organizations that are part of larger systems. But a lot of services, especially in healthcare, are delivered by teams, not just individuals. So if we're trying to implement a new thing in a setting where services are provided by a team, that requires the entire team to make changes in what they do and how they do it. And we don't know very much about how this team level might influence implementation processes and outcomes. Most of our theories, models, and frameworks don't actually explicitly include this team level. So finding this gap in the implementation science literature led me to the science of teams. So what do I mean by a team? A team is a group of people who interact dynamically, interdependently, and adaptively towards a shared goal. Interdependence means that they have to rely on one another to share resources and coordinate workflows. So the work of a team can't be done by people acting on their own. When I talk about teamwork, I'm really using that as a very broad term, and I'm thinking about how teams are set up, what teams and their members think, feel, and do, and how effective teams are. So on the bottom is kind of a fairly simplistic input, mediator, outcomes model of teams, and it just provides us one way to organize all the different kind of team constructs that we might come across. So first, when we think about team inputs, here we're talking about things like team structure, team composition. So how the team is structured includes things like how much interdependence there is, how much do they have to rely on one another, what type of work the team is doing. We can also think about the composition of this team. So how big is the team, how much variability is there in team member characteristics, how much turnover or churn is there in the members of the team. These are all kind of structural compositional features of teams that we can think of as inputs. And then when we think about mediators, here we're really thinking about team functioning, which includes both behavioral processes and emergent states that reflect what teams and their members think, feel, and do. So these are just a few examples. There are lots and lots, but some examples of behavioral processes are things like communication, coordination, goal specification, conflict management, affective states. These are things that exist at the team level. So things like cohesion, trust, psychological safety. And then we also have cognitive states that emerge at the team level. So these are things like shared mental models, which are the extent to which team members share an understanding of what to do and how to do it. And then we have team effectiveness, right? So this is our kind of output or outcome. And team effectiveness is really multidimensional. So we can think about team performance, which just includes things like the quality of the team's work, their efficiency, their productivity. Performance is really context specific. So what it means to be a high performing team might vary across different settings. And it can be measured objectively or subjectively. So, right, so you can think about how many widgets is this team producing? And then you can also ask a team, how efficiently are you producing widgets? So you can measure that different ways. But effectiveness is more than just the team's performance. It also includes the viability of the team. So are members satisfied with their experience on this team? Would they choose to keep working together? Because if a team is well performing but would like disintegrate immediately, that's not a very effective team. We also think about what members are getting out of their experience on the team. So are they learning? Are they developing by being part of the team? So we have decades and decades of research on teams in lots of different settings. And we know from this research that better teamwork leads to greater profits, more innovation, and fewer errors. In healthcare settings specifically, teamwork is associated with better service quality, better patient safety, and better clinical outcomes. And now thinking about teams in the context of implementation science, we have lots of different types of teams that we might think about. So this table is also expanded in a paper I'll reference later if you're interested, but we can think about implementation support teams. So these are teams that are created when you want to implement something new. The goal of the team is to make that implementation happen. Members share responsibility for that. This team might be within or across an organization or system. And teams are typically time limited. So, their goal is to implement it. And then once the implementation effort is done, that team might not exist anymore. We also have existing care teams. So these are teams that already exist in the setting. They share responsibility and are working together to provide care. So for an example, you might think of a surgical team as an existing care team. And in this setting, when you implement something new, you need everybody to participate and make that change happen. So if you want surgery to happen differently, it's not just a one person making the change, it's the whole surgical team that has to change what they're doing. We also have new care teams. So sometimes one of our innovations might be a team-based model of care. So where we're implementing an innovation that requires people to shift from individual responsibilities and tasks to sharing responsibility and working together. We also see a lot of quality improvement teams. So these are similar to implementation support teams in that members are sharing responsibility for improving care, but the focus is different. And so QI teams might be existing teams, they might be created for specific projects, and they're typically within a single organization. And then lastly, we have multi-team systems. So this is when you basically have teams of teams. So you have teams where every team has its own goal, but they're also working together towards a shared goal. So you could think about in an implementation effort, you might have an implementation support team who's trying to help an existing care team make changes. And maybe they're also working with a research team who's trying to evaluate that process. Each of those teams has their own goals, but they're a multi-team system because they're also working towards a broader shared goal. So when we consider both implementation science and the science of teams, I ended up with two big questions. The first one is, how does teamwork affect implementation of new practices? And then the second question is, how can improving teamwork improve implementation? So the systematic review findings that I'm going to present today are an attempt at answering this first question. And then I'm also going to share some ideas at the end about the second question. So jumping into our systematic review. I'm only going to give a brief overview of the methods because we describe them in detail in a published protocol paper as well as our results paper. But I'm happy to answer any questions if there's anything that is unclear or you want more detail about at this point. This is the reference for the outcomes paper for our systematic review. It was published in Implementation Science this summer. So I'll give you the kind of quick version, but there's lots more detail in the paper itself. So we were looking for quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method studies that were done in healthcare or human service settings that were on the implementation of a practice to improve patient care. The studies had to assess at least one team construct and describe its influence on implementation processes and outcomes. And our focus in this systematic review was on existing care teams. So when a team already exists, and then they're asked to do something new, how does the quality of teamwork in that team affect their ability to do that? So we did not include any teams that were created to implement the innovation or as part of the innovation. So that excluded QI teams or implementation support teams. For all of our studies, we evaluated quality and risk of bias using the risk mixed methods appraisal tool. We also rated the relevance to our research question as high, moderate, or low. And then we did a narrative synthesis of studies. And we excluded studies from the synthesis if they were categorized as low quality or low relevance. So we could really focus our synthesis on the higher quality and more relevant studies. Pause for a moment here before I go into the findings in case anybody has any questions about the methods of the systematic review or the kind of the science of teams generally. Oh. Ariana, I can't hear you. I'm not sure if others can, but I might get. Oh, now I can.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just saying, I don't see any questions in the chat yet. But folks, please feel free to pop them in there.
Yeah, and I'll pause a few times during the talk for questions, so feel free to ask questions as we go. I don't mind that at all. Okay, so I'll jump into the systematic review findings. So big picture, we found that implementation science research on teams is definitely increasing. Our search started in 2000 because we kind of figured that's a good metric for like implementation science is starting. Healthcare as a whole is really starting to pay more attention to team-based care. So that was the time point we picked. And you can see most of the studies were really just in the last 10 years. So we have a lot of search results, over 10,000, that we narrowed down to 58 articles from 55 different studies. And they were a mix of study types. So we had 33 qualitative, 15 quantitative, and 10 mixed methods. They were all descriptive observational studies. So no experimental studies or randomized controlled trials, just descriptive studies. And then just bringing back to that model I shared earlier with the inputs, the mediators, the outcomes, this is what we use to organize our synthesis. So we sorted our constructs into these three buckets so we could kind of use that. So we think about those buckets, we ended up with 27 studies that were looking at team inputs. So things like team structure, team composition, 53 studies that were looking at processes and emergent states, so what team members are thinking, feeling, and doing, and only 2 studies that were actually looking at team effectiveness, so things like team performance. For implementation outcomes, we had a decent bit of variability. So the most common outcome was fidelity. The second most common was other, which included things like, extent of implementation success or implementation quality. So I don't think anybody here would be very surprised by that, given our work as a field to try to improve the measurement of implementation outcomes. Still some ways to go. We also ended up including a good chunk of studies that were really just looking at teamwork as a barrier facilitator. So even though our goal originally was to look at how teamwork influenced implementation outcomes, once we actually did our search and realized what was out there, we decided we'd broaden it a little bit so that we would include studies that just looked at implementation, teamwork as a barrier or facilitator to implementation, because there were just so few studies that were looking at specific outcomes. So that ended up being about a third of the studies that we included. And then like I mentioned, we rated them for quality and also for relevance to our study. And so you can see the ones in green are the ones that we ended up including in the narrative synthesis. That's 32 out of the 58 studies. And we had, most of the ones that were excluded were low quality or low relevance. And these were generally like studies where like they mention the word teamwork, but it's like a half sentence. There's no, there's just really nothing there to really dig into. So again, we ended up with 32 studies that are included in our synthesis, and we organized them into these inputs, mediators, outcomes. So for team inputs, the studies in this area looked at things like team stability or instability and staffing shortages, team structure and composition, team interdependence, and hierarchy and professional roles. So these are kind of our 4 buckets of independent variables. There were 5 quantitative studies, and none of them looked at the same inputs and implementation outcomes. So, right, you might have one that looked at team size and fidelity, and another one that looked at, team member characteristics and sustainment, but there's just no overlap in what they were actually studying. There were many more qualitative studies, so 15 qualitative studies, and we were able to make 4 different findings from those qualitative studies. And then for each of the findings that we made, we used grades or qual to assess the strength of the overall body of evidence for each of the findings. So that's what is in parentheses here. It's low, moderate, or high confidence for the qualitative findings. So our first finding is that dedicated and stable team members facilitate implementation, while instability in team membership is a barrier to implementation. Staffing shortages and turnover hinder implementation. Shocking, I know. And then team member competency and expertise, experience and commitment, engagement, facilitated implementation. And then in multidisciplinary settings, rigid professional roles, hierarchical relationships, and power differentials are barriers to implementation. So there are 4 findings, all based on qualitative studies for the team inputs. Next, we looked at team processes and states. So this we kind of split out 2 different ways. One was just overall functioning. So these are measures when they just start talking about all of these things mixed together. So trust and communication and shared goals, all as one kind of overall broad measure of team functioning. And then we also looked at studies that specifically looked at affective states or behavioral process or cognitive state. So first, for overall functioning, we had 9 studies that used a broad measure of team functioning. There was a teeny bit of overlap, but really nothing that allowed us to just generate any estimates of effects for implementation outcomes. And the quality of evidence here was very low. For our qualitative findings, we had 12 studies here, and we were able to make 2 findings. Both high confidence, not particularly exciting. Our first finding is that adaptive team functioning, characterized by positive affective states, effective behavioral processes, and shared cognitive states, facilitates implementation and is associated with better implementation outcomes. And we also found that problems in team functioning included negative affective states, problematic behavioral processes, and a lack of shared cognitive states act as barriers to implementation and are associated with poor implementation outcomes. Nothing very earth-shattering there, still pretty broad, but at least now we have the data to say that for sure, instead of just thinking, well, that makes sense. What we really wanted to say was something more specific than that. So we looked at studies of affective states, 3 quantitative studies, but again, no overlap in the associations they were looking at. And we have 4 qualitative studies. From the qualitative studies, our finding was that trust, cohesion, and psychological safety within teams facilitate implementation by contributing to team members' willingness to speak up and share experiences and feedback. negative affective states, fear of judgment, conflict, and lack of safety hinder implementation. And moderate confidence here, mostly because there just weren't a ton of studies. For behavioral processes, again, we have 4 quantitative studies and no overlap, so I can't tell you anything beyond there are 4 studies out there. For our qualitative studies, we had 7. We were able to make 3 findings. First one, high confidence that open, ongoing, and effective communication within teams facilitates implementation of new practices. Poor communication is a barrier. We also had 2 findings that we're pretty low confidence in because they're not based on a whole lot. Communication beyond the team facilitates implementation by providing opportunities for team learning, and poor coordination among healthcare professionals interferes with providing high quality care and can be a barrier to implementation of new approaches. And then we had looked at cognitive states. So you're probably sensing a theme. Again, not very many quantitative studies and no overlap in what they looked at. We also only had 2 qualitative studies that looked at cognitive states, so definitely fewer than the other areas. And here, because there are only 2 studies, we have pretty low confidence in this finding, but our finding was that shared goals, mission, and vision within teams facilitate implementation and sustainment. And then lastly, our outcomes, we had team effectiveness outcomes, only 2 studies that included looking at how a measure of team effectiveness affected implementation, 1 quantitative and 1 qualitative. So we really couldn't say anything from those. So overall conclusions from our systematic review, relatively few findings that we were able to make with high confidence. Not enough quantitative data on any of these things to be able to synthesize it in a meaningful way, which is really disappointing. And then I think really importantly, we found a lot of issues in the conceptualization of teams, how teams were described, the ways that teams and team constructs were assessed, how team data was analyzed, how team data was interpreted. And so that led us to a lot of recommendations, as you might guess. But before I go into recommendations, I just want to pause a moment and see if people have questions about those findings or about the systematic review as a whole.
Can you hear me, Dr. McGuire?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I don't see any questions in the chat, but one thing that I'm curious to hear you speak on is, why do you think the qual studies were the ones that had kind of like relevant findings for you to work off of as opposed to the quant? Do you have any thoughts around?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, we have a lot of qualitative studies, but it's not like they're the overwhelming majority. I think part of it is just like where the field started, right, was with the describing what was happening. And so there's a broader qualitative base to draw from. Versus when you go to quantitative studies, people then, picked whatever they were going to focus on, and teams just haven't really made the cut, honestly, for most quantitative studies. So I think qualitative studies that really just were describing a really broad range of barriers and facilitators were more likely to pick up on some of these team things. So that's my biggest guess at why there's just more there. It's just more of a reflection of there's a lot more qualitative data on implementation than there is good, strong quantitative data.
It makes a lot of sense. Almost kind of like development of the field perspective. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I will say, like, there were a couple, really nice, good quantitative studies, but they were pretty recent. And I think like we're just starting to kind of do those studies now. So there just unfortunately wasn't much to synthesize. But I'm hopeful that there's a lot more research out there right now that's being done, so that if this was updated in 10 years, we'd be able to make some more meaningful kind of conclusions from the quantitative data.
Totally. Thank you. Well, I still don't see any questions in the chat yet, and I know folks might be accustomed to putting them at the end. So, but folks, feel free. I think we will have at least one other break like this before the end. Is that right, Dr. McGuire?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about recommendations. I'm going to talk about future directions, but feel free to jump in. We'll have plenty of time.
Awesome. Thank you.
Despite my best efforts, I've yet to be able to give a talk that is over 40 minutes, no matter how many slides I put in there. Okay, there's a question. What are some examples of newer studies that are coming up that are interesting, and what makes them more interesting? So some of the work that I've noticed is there's a lot of work in the VA, which is not surprising because the VA has been doing a lot around implementation. And I think the other piece is like there's an intersection of a movement towards team-based care in general in healthcare, and a movement towards studying implementation. So the other piece I think that maybe has limited the number of earlier studies on teams implementing things is maybe there just weren't as many care teams out there, right? If all the care is being provided by individual providers versus teams, then you can't study how those teams are implementing something new. So I think some of the VA studies are really interesting, and they've been able to look at how things are sustained over time and how teamwork affects sustainment, which I think is especially interesting. There's some, if you create a team-based model of care, you can then actually look at like how teamwork in that team affects sustainment of that down the road. The other studies that are coming out, I'm very biased. Some of them are mine. So I, of course, think they're interesting. That's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so diving into some recommendations. So I've got 5 different domains of recommendations. The first one is around conceptualizing teams. Oh, okay, so like I mentioned in the very beginning, we have all these theories, models, and frameworks. Most of them don't really explicitly mention teams. I know like the CFR 2.0 has teaming in there, but that's really kind of specific to like the process of like teaming to implement something. It doesn't really fit as much when there's an existing care team. So I think there's a lot of room where we can integrate teams and team constructs into the theories, models, and frameworks we already have. And I want to be clear, I don't think we need more. I think we can put them into what we have. And the other piece is that we can use really well-established theories of team effectiveness to develop our hypotheses about how team constructs will affect implementation. There's a lot of really strong, rich scientific research on teams. So we're not starting from scratch. We can use the theories that have been developed in these other fields that are studying teams to think about how teams would matter for implementation. So this is a figure from a paper that I wrote recently on integrating teams into the EPIS framework. And so we show some examples of the team constructs that I previously mentioned put into an implementation research logic model. So you can see in the determinants box, we have some of our team inputs, structural features, compositional features. Then in our implementation strategies, I'll talk about these at the end, but these are some implementation strategies that might affect teamwork. So then our mechanisms are team processes and states that we expect our implementation strategies to be able to change. If we can change those mechanisms, we can improve team effectiveness, which we then think would improve implementation outcomes and ultimately clinical outcomes. So it's just an example of one way we've been working to integrate our team constructs and team science into implementation science. This is the reference for that paper. It was in Implementation Research and Practice. We also include in that paper some kind of taking some studies that have looked at teams and implementation science and like applying the EPIS model to understand like where teams fit. This is one place where I really like the EPIS model because it's really flexible, right? So you might have teams that are very much like within the inner context, but you also might have teams that are more of a bridging factor where they're working across systems. So we give some examples of different types of teams in that paper. Second domain is thinking about how we describe teams. So this was maybe digging through these papers really challenging because a lot of the time they just said team, but there was nothing that told us why they were a team of people and not just a group, right? So a group, every team is a group, but not every group is a team. A team has to rely on one another. They have to work together versus just a group of individuals. So sometimes it wasn't really clear, like, is this actually a team that has to work together to provide care? Or is this just like a group of people who are in the same unit who we're calling a team? So I think one way to really be clear about how we're describing teams is to describe the team structure, the purpose, and the interdependencies. Like, so how do people rely on one another? And that makes it a little bit different. Okay, I'm just seeing Margaret's question. I'm gonna pause on that and I'll answer it later though. So we also want to describe sampling of teams. So you can think about, sampling of individuals within teams, but you can also think about sampling of teams. What is the population of teams that you're sampling from? So that's something that we found was pretty rarely described. So for example, if you're working within a hospital setting and you're studying teams in that hospital, well, how many teams were there? How many teams are participated? Then of the teams that are participating, how many people in those teams are participating? And similarly reporting the team level response rates. So it's different to say, your overall, we surveyed team members from 20 different teams and our response rate was 70%. Okay, great. But what was the response rate for each team, right? If it was 10% in one team and 100% in another team, that affects how you would handle your data. So reporting not just the overall response rate, but also the team level response rate. Okay, assessing teams and team constructs. Okay, so here I think there's just a lot of room for improvement in our measurement. And so increasing the specificity, so not just teamwork broadly or like overall team functioning, but really thinking about, is there a specific affective state you think would matter, a specific behavioral process or a structure of the team? And then again, here's where we can draw from existing literature. There's a lot of reliable and valid measures of teams in other settings. So we don't need to be developing a ton of like homegrown measures or single item measures. We can use some of the things that have been developed by people who have been studying this for decades. And we also think it can do a better job at describing the organizational and the system context of teams, right? So we can think about those multiple layers of influence. Where are teams situated? And, are they within an organization? Are they across an organization? What system are they working in? Thinking about those constraints. When it comes to analyzing team data, often what we want to do is aggregate to the team level so we can say something about the team as a whole instead of just the individuals within that team. So if we want to do that, we need to actually evaluate within team agreement so that we know if this is actually something that team members agree on enough that we can get a team level measure of it. And that's important because if we want to make inferences about the team level, we need to analyze our data at the team level. So I think this is a common research challenge, but just really making sure that the level that of our data analysis matches the level that we're making inferences at. And then again, accounting for clustering of teams within organizations, I think this is not necessarily a statistical thing because generally like research with teams is hard and they might all be within one organization or 3 organizations. But even just, if you can't account for that statistically, just acknowledging that teams within an organization are going to be more similar than teams in different organizations. And so thinking about that piece as well. And then thinking about interpreting team data. So again, going back to the broader literature on teams, right? What's similar, what's different, using the existing literature to constitute our findings, and then also using our findings to refine our own theories, models, and frameworks in implementation science. Okay, and then I'll pause because I think there are a couple of questions here. Oh, all right, Ariana, you're quiet again.
Oh, how about now? Okay, I'm so sorry. So first question from Margaret. Could you speak a bit about who should be prioritized into an implementation team, e.g. middle managers, clinical managers? Similarly, could you say a bit about the identities of, about the identities of team members that can create effective teams?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that there's like a specific role. I think it's probably going to depend on what the implementation effort requires, right? Like, is it more about changing policies and practices at like a higher level versus changing the on the ground thing? And it's generally probably both. So it's maybe more thinking about like what are the tasks that the team will need to do, and then who's the best person to do those tasks. I think one thing that's really important is just and this goes more to like the general like push versus pull of implementation, but thinking about, are people being put onto an implementation team whether they want to be or not, or is this people who care about this and are willing to put in extra effort? Because I think it's pretty rare in healthcare or human services for people to get any like protected time or change in job duties to do these tasks. Generally, this is on top of whatever they're already doing. So I think that like motivation and willingness to put in the extra effort is probably more important than whatever their specific position is. I think generally in teams too, thinking about hierarchy, sometimes, having one implementation team might not be make the most sense if you're gonna have people who are really in different positions and different levels of power. Um, so one thing too, I think thinking about like the structure of teams and how they're set up, is it a single implementation team? Is it a multi-team system where it's going to be more complicated to manage, but maybe it'd be more efficient to have a little, team of 3 people who are clinical supervisors who are doing this piece, and then an administrative team who's doing this piece. Um, so I don't know that I have any like clear recommendations. I think like specifying the work of the team is probably the best place to start. Um, which is hard because part of the work of the team is to figure out the work of the team. But that's one thing to think about too, is like being flexible about changes in team composition over time, and building in opportunities to reflect and say, do we have the right people on this team right now? Is somebody not really contributing or not involved, or their work isn't just as relevant now? Maybe that's okay to change people out. So building in some checkpoints for that might make sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So we just got a fourth question come in. I'm wondering if maybe we do one more now and then let you kind of move forward with your slides and then we continue. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I only have like a few more slides, and they're
Oh,
just
okay.
kind of like implementation strategies and
Okay. Sounds good. I just want to make sure we're striking that
yeah.
balance. So, okay. So the next question, Elizabeth, thank you for discussing the difference between teams versus groups. Do you have thoughts on best practices for starting/engaging in team science research when your primary home is academia and not active clinical care, with an aim to understand implementation considerations?
Okay. Um, so first I just want to distinguish a little bit between like team science and the science of teams, because they sound like the same thing, but they're not. So team science is the idea of like doing science as a team, meaning that you're interdependent with other researchers and you can't do all the research by yourself. So I think there's been a really big push, kind of actually alongside the push towards team-based approaches to healthcare, to team-based approaches to research. And so that's usually what we mean by like team science, is the process of doing science as a team. And then the science of teams is doing research on teams, which you could do by yourself or as part of a team. Very confusing. We also have the science of team science, which is researchers studying how researchers are doing research as teams. It's a little confusing there, but hopefully that's helpful. So I say that partly because I'm not sure if your question's about like doing science as a team or doing science on teams. But I think the bigger picture, I guess, of just starting research in when your primary home and your setting is not wherever your research is happening. Um, I guess my approach would just be try to find ways to spend time in that setting as much as you can. I think that's really critical. And maybe that's just maybe that's not specific to a research study, and just spending time observing and making friends with people and seeing if they'll let you hang out and talk to you about what they do in a day. I think that's really helpful. It can be hard to get people to let you do that. I have also found that some ways, like something that can be helpful in kind of getting research started and getting those relationships started, is having a very small pilot study. So there's a reason for people to talk to you, but you're also not asking a lot. Um, that would be my main recommendation, is just try to find ways to spend time in that setting if you can. So because your research is going to rely on people who are not in your daily life and not in your department and that sort of thing. So finding ways to spend time in those spaces. I mean, those going to some of their own conferences or things like that.
Wonderful. Thank you. So maybe I'll pause. We do have a couple more questions, but I'll pause and let you do some slides and then we'll
Okay.
reconvene.
Sounds good. Okay, so my last little bit is just some future directions. So I mentioned earlier I had these 2 questions, right? How does teamwork affect implementation new practices? And then how can improving teamwork improve implementation? So here, thinking about team-focused implementation strategies, in the EPIS paper that I mentioned earlier, we discussed 3 different categories of team-focused implementation strategies. So I'm breaking these down into strategies that create teams, strategies that target teams, and strategies that improve teams. So when you think about strategies that create teams, in our existing, compilations of implementation strategies, we have strategies that are about creating a new team. So for example, these are Eric's strategies about creating a new clinical team or organizing an implementation team meeting. These, I would say, are team-focused strategies because they're creating a team where one wasn't before. We can also think about strategies that target teams. And so again, this is thinking about our existing strategies, things that we're doing, but just targeting them to the team level. So we have strategies like audit and feedback. We could develop disincentives. Those are things that you can do at any level. So you can give audit and feedback to individuals on their own outcomes. You can also do that at the team level. So that's actually a specific type of interdependence, is when people are evaluated on their work as a team, then they're interdependent on each other, right? Because I can't have good outcomes unless we have good outcomes. So if you want to increase interdependence in your team, one way to do that would be to use audit and feedback at the team level. So that's one category of strategies, thinking about strategies we already have and just targeting them to the team instead of individuals. And then the third category, I think this is the most novel. These are strategies that draw from team development interventions. So as I mentioned, there's a huge body of research on teamwork and ways to improve teams. And so there are a lot of effective team development interventions. So any of these interventions could be drawn on to support implementation. So team training is interventions that are really focused on building skills that are important for good teamwork. So things like effective communication skills would be a type of team training. We also have team building, which people are more familiar with. That's a little bit more affective, more focused on building relationships, but it is effective. So team building interventions. Team debriefing is really just getting teams in the practice of reflecting on their own performance, because when we do that, we get better. Team charters are an intervention that's really thinking about how the team is set up. So an intervention that you could have put in place, for example, if you're trying to create an implementation support team, using a team charter is a specific way you could intervene at the beginning of that process to improve teamwork down the line. So those are the strategies I think are exciting to explore. My little summary here. Teams and teamwork matter for implementation. I think we all kind of knew that, but hopefully now we have a little bit more data to actually say, yes, here's how. We know that better teams provide better care. So we can also, think about how we can get better teams in implementation so that we can help teams better implement new practices and further improve care. And I think this is especially important in when we're serving populations with really complex needs that benefit from a team-based approach. So for me, for example, I'm really interested in improving mental health outcomes for children who experience maltreatment. And these kids are often involved in lots of different systems and lots of different professionals involved. So if we really want to improve the quality of care for that population, focusing at the team level makes a lot of sense because it can strengthen the whole system they're in rather than just improving one piece of it. So that's all I had. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to stop sharing and then we'll just take questions for a little bit.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. So next question. That distinction, group versus teams, is very interesting. Can you give some examples about when a care team might be a group versus a team? I know you mentioned that kind of like interdependence piece. Does it have to do with organizational structure primarily, or is there also a dimension that relates to the culture of the group / team / unit?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think there are probably different ways to think about this, but the one I come back to most frequently is how much people have to rely on one another. And so you can think about that at the task level. Like, can I do my work without other people doing theirs? Or is it like, am I waiting for you to do that so I can do this so that then you can do that? And then there's also the outcome interdependence. So maybe we can work somewhat separately, but we're really just evaluated on what we produce as a whole. So I think those are the kind of key things I think about. So we often have groups of people that work together and, they can kind of do their own thing. So if you think about like a unit in a hospital, you have lots of people working there. if they're assigned to a specific patient and like that's their patient and they just take care of their patient during their shift and then their shift ends and the next person takes over, yeah, they're all working together, but that's a group, really. Like they don't rely in the same way on other people. But you also might have a unit where maybe it's organized so that, maybe every patient, patients are assigned to like one of three teams. And then there are four nurses who work all the patients that are assigned there. And so they are reliant on one another because like I can't see every single patient here, right? Like I need you to see some of them and I need you to do this piece so that then I can do this piece. So part of it is about like kind of how the structure of the team's work is set up, and how the structure, how the team is being evaluated.
Lot of sense. Next question, what are the key considerations to make concerning teams when introducing an intervention?
Okay, so I'm guessing this is like when you're introducing intervention, like implementing a new intervention.
My interpretation as well, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I'd say thinking about what the team's work is and how this is going to change the team's work, right? So we often think about like what individuals have to do differently, but thinking about at the team level, right? So taking that just from individual, oh, well, now you have to do this, but like how is that going to change somebody else's work, right? Because a lot of the time it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person on the team is making the same changes or has to do the same things differently. But really thinking about like the cascade of things. If my work depends on your work and now you're doing something differently, what do I need to do differently, if anything? Um, the other thing I think is, sometimes just thinking about more removed kind of supportive behavior. So maybe like I don't actually have to change anything, but what could I change that would be helpful to you as you're trying to make this change? So I think really thinking through like the workflows of the team and where those interdependencies are, I think can be really helpful in thinking through what are the things that are going to have to change for something to be implemented successfully.
Thank you. Next question. Team training typically includes various components. Which specific aspect would you recommend prioritizing to enhance team cohesion during the implementation of an innovation? If you had to choose one, would you focus on communication strategies, role clarification, conflict resolution, or leadership development? And maybe I'll start with that, and then there's a second question, but I'll go one at a time because that's a chunk already.
Yeah, great question with no right answer. I can give my own like personal bias, but I think it's like asking a therapist, like, if you could only do one thing in therapy, what would you do? You know, so I think that team functioning piece, right? Like our behavior affects our emotions, that affects how we think, and all of those things are connected. That's true for teams too. So I personally am biased to starting with behavior. I'm a bit of a behaviorist, so I think focusing on things that are very concrete and clear is the easiest way to change those other things. So, people often are like, but how do I build trust in my team? I'm like, well, let's talk about the behavior, right? Like, what can I do to like be more consistent in responding to my team members' requests for help? That's a behavior that will eventually build trust, but it's a lot easier to target. Um, so I think I target like specific behaviors generally, but it's still pretty general. I guess I would also think about the why, like thinking about why is this team doing this? Because I think that I've found that that's really critical. When teams have a shared understanding, this is more, a cognitive state, but when teams have a shared understanding of what their purpose is and how this fits into their purpose, they're much more likely to be motivated to do something. Um, so if you're thinking about in the context of an implementation effort specifically, I would think about bringing teams to thinking about the why. Why are we a team? What is our shared goal? And how does this fit into that? If you're thinking about just teamwork broadly, I think that you could kind of just pick any behavioral process, and I would just pick whatever the team feels like is the most relevant for them and would be the most helpful for them.
Makes a lot of sense. The second part to the question, would that recommendation change based on how well established the team is?
Yeah. I think if a team is especially well established, they might be more able to tell you what they need. So I think that's probably your best bet is for a well-established team, like giving them the tools to reflect on their own functioning and decide where they want to focus their efforts. We've done some work, some team training work with a modular training. It was developed for healthcare, it's team steps, but we adapted it into a version for child abuse multidisciplinary teams. And the way we set it up was really like, here's all the content, but it's up to you in this last module to really like pick the things that you think are most relevant for your team and decide what you're going to do to move forward with those specific skills, because you can't change everything at once. But I think sometimes it can be helpful to kind of give a broad overview of like, here's all of the things that might be relevant, and then let teams decide what they want to work on themselves.
Totally, totally. And that makes a lot of sense too, given what you mentioned about motivation, where like, this is something that they see as a high priority area to focus on that, that they can kind of understand, or see like the relevance of that work. That makes a lot of sense, to start there, for sure. Um, well, we still have a few more minutes, so if there are any other questions folks want to pop in the chat, you're welcome to do so. One thing I was curious about, and I think you've kind of touched on this, and it's possible that I missed it, but does or has like power dynamics kind of within the team, or like, that kind of like social structure, is that something that has come up? Because anecdotally, that feels like it's relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something where the qualitative studies in our systematic review had a lot more mentions of hierarchy and power dynamics, and that really, in a lot of settings, acting as a barrier to implementation, because often, the team has to make changes. So that's everybody. And if you have one person at the top who's not into it, that makes it really hard. And I think that, there's just more generally a lot of work on hierarchy and patient safety, and hierarchy not being good generally. But I also want to caution, like, it doesn't mean we should totally have like a flat, no hierarchy, everybody's equally responsible, because for a lot of things, we do need somebody who's taking responsibility, right? Like somebody who's ultimately responsible. That's one of the challenges of team-based care, is when you have more interdependence, you can get that diffusion of responsibility, and you still need to be clear about, even when people are relying on one another, who's responsible for what pieces. But there's definitely a lot of research from the qualitative studies on hierarchy being a barrier, especially, when we're trying to make change and we want to encourage people to speak up and say, oh, can we do it this way? Or what about that? And that definitely is a challenge.
And I could see too, if, one is in the position of being maybe like an implementation facilitator, like kind of coming in externally and doing maybe some of this formative work on determinants, maybe there being a role for that facilitator of kind of like raising up the voices of the folks who are maybe more disempowered in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
I could see that being part of this work.
Yeah, and that might go back to like thinking about how you're going to set up an implementation team in a setting that might be really influenced by the power dynamics and existing hierarchy in that setting. In some organizations, it might make a lot of sense to just have one team with everybody on it. In others, that's just a guarantee that you won't hear the perspectives of half of the team.
Totally.
So I think that, it's hard because we want to say like, okay, here's the standard approach that's going to work for everybody, and we're never going to have that. But thinking about like that kind of initial assessment and how you use that information to form a team that's most likely to be effective.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have 4 more minutes. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but maybe I'll give folks like one more minute to add any last minute questions, and I'll give kind of a brief plug for our presentation next week, our next presentation in the series. So it'll be next Tuesday, October 29th, again at noon. And we will have Dr. Amelia Van Pelt presenting on applying implementation science to advance global health. So we would love to have folks join us then as well. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions, and you've done a beautiful job, Dr. McGuier, of kind of answering questions as we go. And we've had some wonderful questions today. So I think unless there's any final thoughts or final questions, we could probably maybe end just 3 minutes early.
Yeah, I just put my email in the chat. If anybody has any questions, feel free to send me an email. I like to chat about teams and implementation, so I'm happy to do that anytime. Thank you all for coming today.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you, Dr. McGuire.
Yeah, thanks.